Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the Holocaust Center for Humanities Lunch and Learn program. I'm Alana Cohn-Kennedy, the Holocaust Center's Director of Education. The Holocaust Center for Humanity in downtown Seattle sits on the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people, past and present. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish tribe. The Holocaust Center for Humanity is open on Sundays. You can reserve your tickets now for the exhibit, Finding Light in the Darkness. You might also be interested in participating in a teacher workshop we have coming up this Thursday at 3:30 called From Reflection to Action. Whether or not you are a teacher or an individual who just likes to learn, this workshop will give practical ideas for how a person might contribute to the process of creating a more humane, just, and compassionate world. Each of us has the power to make a difference. Give Big, Washington's annual giving campaign, starts today. This is your opportunity to support organizations doing great work in our community. The Holocaust Center is raising funds to support teacher training, like the one we have on Thursday. We know that students who study the Holocaust are more likely to stand up for others. Despite the challenges and obstacles to teaching this past year, educators have continued to prioritize teaching about the Holocaust. One teacher in Central Washington explained it this way: "It is important for me to ensure my students understand the atrocities of the Holocaust. They need to know what happens when bigotry, hate, and prejudice are allowed to go unchecked." Funds raised through Give Big mean that we can reach even more students. All donations made today and tomorrow will be matched 1-to-1, and you can donate today through the link that we'll post in the chat. Several months ago, I invited Dr. Sarah Zaides Rosen, Associate Professor at the University of Washington's Stroum Center for Jewish Studies, to be a presenter for one of our lunchtime programs. An accomplished instructor and academic, there was no shortage of historical topics that sounded fascinating that she could speak on. We selected a topic related to the former Soviet Union, and she emailed me a description of the presentation along with her bio. The bio was impressively filled with her publications and positions, and then at the very end, in one short sentence, it read, "Sarah is also a competitive equestrian." I paused. Why did this catch me by surprise that a Jewish studies professor should also ride horses? I called her on the phone to find out more, and at her suggestion, I checked out the book Horse Crazy by Sarah Maslin Nir, the daughter of a Holocaust survivor. The same day I obtained the audiobook, read by the author, I binged it in a weekend. The book is a reflection not only on the author's deep love and maybe even obsession with horses, but the long effects of the Holocaust on the generations after. The tensions and struggles that come with being the first generation born after a trauma and the first generation in America, the ongoing struggle with belonging and not belonging at the same time. It is my honor to have with us today award-winning New York Times journalist and author of the book Horse Crazy, Sarah Maslin Nir. Leading the discussion today is Dr. Sarah Zaides Rosen, the Associate Director of the Stroum Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Washington, as well as the Director of the Graduate Fellowship Program. She is also a member of the Board of Directors of the Holocaust Center for Humanity. Thank you to our community partner on this week's program, the Stroum Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Washington. Our speakers will take questions at the end of the program. Please type in your questions at any time in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. I want to start by letting Sarah Maslin Nir introduce her book and her horse in this short video.
My name is Sarah Maslin Nir, and I'm the author of Horse Crazy. This is Stellar Maslin Nir, and we are going to read a little bit from my upcoming book. I hope you enjoy. In the decade I've worked for the New York Times, I've reported across the country and around the world. And as soon as I file each story, I do one thing before I head home. I search for the horses. The rider in me wants to gaze at them, stroke them, gallop with them. But the reporter in me has only one goal: to know their stories. And so I found myself, notebook in hand, interviewing the keepers of the street horses of Senegal, West Africa, as the animals slept in corrals of parked cars. I've traced the Viking history of the Canadian-Norwegian fjord horse, who extracted us both from a peat bog in the Scottish Highlands. And I've quizzed Indian soldiers about the indigenous battle horses I charged through a quarry in Rajasthan. For my entire life, I've sought out horses endlessly, even in the urban world in which I grew up. As a girl, I found them on the Upper West Side, in a barn disguised as an old townhouse. I found them underneath the Triborough Bridge in Harlem and stampeding through Central Park. And yet all this time, I never asked myself why. Why do I love horses?
Welcome, everyone. I'm so excited to be a part of this program. And I think that video clip just ended it in a really nice place for me to ask you, Sarah. So you are Sarah who loves Susim. You're Sarah who loves horses from New York City, the daughter of a Holocaust survivor. And I want to first ask you, where did you first find horses growing up in New York City?
Sure. What a cliffhanger that video ended on. It's quite a bit longer, and so is the book. But that's the project of the book, to answer that question for me and so many others. First of all, I didn't know that story that Alana told about you, because the bottom of my New York Times bio, when it lists everything I've done, the last one is she loves horses, the last line. So I love that we have that in common. Yeah, so the root of my obsession it started when I was 2 years old, and my family, I'm a born and raised Manhattanite, the daughter of an immigrant Holocaust survivor. You know, we don't have a horsey pedigree, no pun intended, in our family. And yet I was very kinetic. I wouldn't stop running around. And my parents had this bright idea, not so bright, it turns out, that maybe I would sit still on a horse. I'd be moving, but I'd be in one place. And that began this very unfortunate for them, because in the early days they financed it, love affair with horses. Now unfortunate for me, because I have to finance the addiction.
I can certainly relate to that. So can you describe a little bit? I mean, there were so many different places that you described riding out on Long Island, but also at the Claremont Academy. And I just think for, especially those of us in Seattle that are more accustomed to, you know, accessible kind of farmland places where you can ride horses, like what's the Claremont Academy like?
Sure. So I grew up riding in a 4-story apartment building filled with horses up on the top floor and in the basement. And the horses would actually climb up and down steps to get to their stalls. And it was really wild. The riding arena was a parking garage, and parking garages, as you may have noticed, have stanchions in them. So you're going around trying not to hit other horses, trying not to hit stanchions. And the only relief was rides through Central Park. Well, anyone who's ever been to a big city park knows those are not bucolic, peaceful places either. And you had to avoid rollerbladers and taxi cabs on the way to the park. And then actually I ended up, as my senior year of high school, being Officer Nir, a mounted parks enforcement officer, riding for the New York City Parks Department, patrolling that park on horseback. And those giant draft horses, draft are those Budweiser type horses that you see, huge, also lived in the rafters of Claremont Riding Academy. But, you know, where there's a will, there's a way. I was this Jewish girl out of place in the city, and yet I would find horses wherever I could.
So you said that you're not from, your family doesn't have a kind of horsey pedigree, but yet horses kind of throughout the book play this like really important kind of mythological role. And it's so tied up in history and memory. And I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit about that special role that horses played.
Yeah, that's a great way to phrase it, Sarah, a mythological role, because they're part of the American mythos and ethos. I describe them as furls of the American flag in equid form. Somehow horses bound up in this sense of freedom, this sense of wildness, are our American birthright. And even as a first generation person, I felt that they were somehow part of my American identity. What's super interesting about that is the idea of these wild horses that have the run of the land are actually totally false. There's no such thing as a wild horse, except for one breed called the Przewalski's wild horse, which lives in Mongolia. Every other horse is essentially feral. I like to describe them as junkyard cats that people let out. And so to me, in unpacking this obsession, who do horses belong to and why do I feel they belong to me, that gave me the idea that they're a fiction, they're a construct. And if they're a construct, if their Americanness is a construct, they're really just feral creatures someone let go once, maybe I can construct my own world with them.
Totally. So kind of building on that idea of, maybe a construct, but what did, you have this, you described this great scene about your father. Maybe actually it'd be first helpful if you could tell us a little bit about your father and kind of this, incredible, just this incredible life that he lived and the incredible circumstances that he overcame before we kind of circle back.
Sure. Yeah. And my father is a huge part of my identity. I realized in this, which I think when you have somebody who survived, as I say, the fulcrum of war, they become a larger than life figure. So my father was named Yehuda Nir. Actually, he was born Julius Grunfeld in Lvov, Poland in 1930. After the war, he didn't want a Germanic name. He said, the Germans tried to murder me, and I don't want anyone seeing my success as that of a good German boy. So he actually translated his name. Grunfeld became a green field, which is what Nir means in Hebrew, and Yehuda means Jew. So undeniably who he was. And part of the reason why my dad wanted to assert his identity is he had to hide in plain sight under false identities during the Holocaust. He had a false baptismal certificate that made him into Julian Skrzywo, a nice Polish Catholic boy. And he and his mother and sister hid in plain sight, bouncing all around under these assumed identities. His father, a prominent businessman in Lvov, was murdered in the early parts of the war. And my dad would be very careful to say murdered, not killed. He said, enemy combatants were killed, civilians are murdered. And so my father, his battle to survive, it didn't feel like it ended in America, in our posh life that he carved out for himself by becoming eventually a prominent psychiatrist, despite only having a 5th grade education after the war ended. It felt like it continued, and it continued in the riding ring for me even.
So, speaking of the riding ring, so you describe this great scene where you're at the Hampton Classic Horse Show. And for those of us who might not be so familiar with the Hampton Classic, maybe you can describe kind of what it is. My understanding is that that's one of the few horse shows that your father really attended, wasn't it? So can you tell us a bit about what happened there?
Yeah, I should back up a tiny bit, which is when I started examining this passion in myself and so many others. I like to say this isn't a book about horses. This is a reported book about obsession through the lens of my own. And one of the things that I struggled with as a child was here I am with this funny accented dad and these, Ellis Island refugee grandparents on my mom's side, asserting my place in a world of, the way I describe it, of Flaxen Ashleys and Charlottes, of Jackie Kennedy. That this is her world, and who am I? And I used to say to my dad, Dad, this is the world of Ralph Lauren, who cladded in jodhpurs and cashmere. And Dad would say, not Ralph Lauren, Sarah, Ralphie Lifshitz. That's Ralph Lauren's original name. He's a Jew from Queens, just like my mom. And again, that speaks to me that identity is what you make it and what you claim of it. Ralph Lauren invented equestrian Americana just in the way that White Christmas was written by a Jew. And that helped me assert my place in this world. But at the Hampton Classic Horse Show, I went, it's the most prestigious horse show on the East Coast. And I competed it when I was 17 years old. And I had really absorbed the messaging of this intergenerational trauma, that I didn't belong there, that I wasn't part of this world. So I competed because I loved it. I put my horse away and I went and got funnel cake. You know, that's what you do when you're the also ran. You know, you don't belong in the winner's circle. But my dad waited at the side of the ring all day because it's a huge competition. And in the end, I actually got second place out of 60 of the best riders in the country. And I was nowhere to be found. So the first place horse walks into the winner's circle, you know, strides in this train of horses. And there's my little bald Polish dad. You know, he had me late in life, so he was already elderly by then, walks in. He takes the ribbon from the judge, the second place ribbon, he puts it on his chest, and he raises up both his hands and says to the judge, "I defeated Hitler." And, you know, I told that story to my dad's casket at his funeral. And I'm getting emotional just thinking about it. You know, for my dad, living well was the best revenge, but just living was, right? Because that's what they didn't want for us. And I also realized, you know, the connection between a father and a daughter, oh God, I'm really getting emotional thinking about it, was that I was confident I didn't have what it took. But my dad, knowing nothing about horses, was sure I had won a prize. You know, and so there's a lot of layers in that. But for my dad, my riding horses was really expectorating in the eyes of the forces that tried to erase us entirely.
Right. I think you spoke a little bit in a different part of the book about the reparations that your father received from Germany and what he thought that the money should be used for, that it had to be used for something completely frivolous and luxury, because wealth was, you know, I think you said, I have a quote here actually, not something my father admired for its own sake or for what it could buy. He admired it as an unassailable marker of our invulnerability against the best efforts of murderers who tried to wipe him out. To my father, our horse, our Hampton's horse, was proof that the Nazis had lost. And I think that's, you know, it's such a, you know, for so many, especially first generation, you know, people in the United States that, you know, have such complicated kind of interactions with, you know, with leisure and with money and with their neighbors. It's just so, it so resonates for so many of us. But your father also, you know, there were a couple of stories from the war that I want to kind of go back to, that your father transmitted down to you. Can you tell us about the horses in the field and the ginger a little bit?
Oh, so this is a fun story. So I really wanted to have horses in my family, right? Like this talk about belonging and not belonging. I wanted that equestrian pedigree that said I was part of this world. And so my father, one day when I was quite young, he said, "Sarah, you know, whenever I speak about him, I speak in his accent, but I'll try not to. But he said, you know, we had horses in our family." And I was like, "Really? What?" I think I was 8, 9 or something. And he said, "Yes." And his story went as follows. In World War I, we had a subversive Polish cousin. And this subversive Polish cousin would realize that he was against the war. And he would realize that the Polish, they weren't Polish then, but the proto-Polish armies were galloping through the woods, and they would destroy the horses that they rode in the cavalry. They would be totally used up and broken, and they would discard them as they passed through in the woods and fields. So this clever, canny cousin, this is my dog, by the way, that he just had a little neuter, so he's in his sad cone. Sorry, dogs and animals are a horse girl thing. They're always around us. He would gather up these horses that were all destroyed and broken, and then he would send a runner out to tell the cavalry where they were encamped, "We have fresh horses. Come, we'll sell you them. And they're fresh and they're wild." So he would post a lookout, and right before the cavalry would come shopping, he would put pepper into the horses' anuses. And that would make the horses wild. They would be bucking and roaring. And the cavalry would be so thrilled that here were these wild stallions, they would buy back their own really compromised horses. And they would obviously deflate the minute they left the stables. But my father loved that story, not just because it was about horses. That's why I loved it. I thought, oh, here I have this, animal whispering cousin, only to realize he was, a scam artist. But my father loved that because here he was taking the trope of the Jewish Shylock, of the crafty, nefarious Jew, and turning it on its head and using it as a way for power. So in my father's retelling, the cousin wasn't a Shylock, but he was a pacifist. He was a person who outsmarted a war effort. And my father would often say about himself that he was a 9-year-old boy who outwitted 80 million Germans who wanted to murder him, and that he was too diabolical for them to win. And that was a big point of pride. So I found that story meaningful when I was a kid, and then meaningful when I unpacked it further as the daughter of a psychiatrist and psychologist can't help but do.
Absolutely. And there's another story about your father riding away to freedom, pulled by a horse, and you connected it kind of so beautifully to your own life in New York City, that he would he said he ran away from the Germans on this, being pulled by this 2-year-old horse.
Yeah.
And that when you would come home from mucking stalls and spending your days at the stable, kind of doing the work that's required of all of the young riders, that he would smell your hair and it would remind him of the smell of freedom, of riding away from the Germans.
Yeah. Should I read that little section?
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay, great. So I have quite a bit of self-consciousness of intermingling these thoughts of as I say, Nazis and ponies. And I often think that the dyed-in-the-wool horse people who buy this book are like, why is there so much Hitler in this book about horses? This is sort of addressing that head on. And so at the end of the war, my father was impressed on a German farm. Actually, this is an interesting fact that the family that housed them were inducted into Yad Vashem. And my dad boycotted it because he said they didn't know we were Jews. They housed us because they thought we were Poles, and also because we were free slave labor. And it ended up with a big controversy with that family. And this is cool. The family, this was in the 90s, the son hired a historian to debunk my father. The historian was German and ended up in jail because you're not allowed to be a Holocaust denier. So it was really interesting. My dad in his book describes the daughter of the family as very ugly, and that when they would play ball, he would aim for her face because she was a Nazi sympathizer. And the person's debunking was pictures of the child saying she was really cute. So anyway, the twists keep coming. I need to stop here and say what I once said to my father, that by comparison to him, I don't feel like a real person. It seemed to me that only my father could be, forged in the fire of war, made canny by needs as atomistic as survival, and that everyone else with nice lives and non-mortal traumas was necessarily a soft-bellied simulacrum. Never envy me my wounds, my father said harshly, setting me straight. I envy you were spared your own. My life with horses has induced at times deep survivor's guilt, as can, frankly, things like general well-being, a roof over my head, a good job, and even a nice sunny day, when you have a father who is a victim of atrocities and thus feel no right to any ease of your own. Even writing intermingled paragraphs about ponies and Nazis feels off, but they are the threads of my story that braided together form my life. And I must remind myself that my father himself never compared battle wounds and found others wanting. As a psychiatrist, he specialized in treating post-traumatic stress disorder, validating the scars of others, whatever their source. And to him, as to me, horses were freedom. On April 28th, 1945, my father was 15. His tattered family had been impressed into hard labor on a German farm by Nazi-sympathizing farmers who believed they were harboring Polish refugees, not Jews. Suddenly, on a ridge, were Russian soldiers. The war was over. My father, his mother, and his sister rode away from the farm to freedom in a Britska, a four-wheeled carriage, pulled by, quote, the only horse left in the stable, a 2-year-old mare that hadn't been trained yet to pull a carriage and therefore had been left behind by the Russians, my father wrote in his book, The Lost Childhood. Quote, we were all happy, except the horse, who was having a hard time adjusting to her first job. And so throughout his life, the scent of horses conjured freedom, full of relief, full of peace. He'd sigh deeply into my hair when he hugged me after a long day of mucking stalls, and grooming horses brought the barn home with me. And on 59th Street and 5th Avenue, among the Central Park carriage horses and the scent of his remembered liberation. When he drove to the stables to pick me up from doing chores or riding horses, my father would roll down the windows and close his eyes.
So, I mean, some of your family history and kind of like getting to the bottom of like whether or not there were actual horses and what kind of, and this desire to kind of want to connect to this like tradition of equestrianism. I find so interesting because the especially the hunter jumper world, and also I think, the cowboy kind of world that I'm a little less familiar with, but it certainly has its own kind of mythologies. But it's so tied and almost obsessed with tradition, to the point where, at like our governing bodies, annual meeting, I think they spent like several days discussing whether or not, a proper attire would include a burgundy coat or not. Like, it's just like almost kind of absurd. But your book really kind of goes into some of the ways in which horse history, or particularly certain people in horse history, have really been occluded from these traditional tellings and from these traditions. And I was really fascinated by your work on the Black Cowboys. And so I'm hoping you could tell us, just a little bit about that, and kind of like just the context for that, and for, also I think you wrote an article about this outside of the book, but the museum in Texas, and kind of who the Black Cowboys are and kind of what they're trying to do.
Sure. So one of the things that I found really compelling was I worked like a city girl trying to find horses everywhere, believe it or not, at a barn in the middle of the East River on the edge of Harlem. And I worked for, when I was in my 20s, and I worked for a really ornery old couple, Dr. and Mrs. Blair. Don't you dare call them by their first names, Sarah. They were very tough. And we taught riding to inner city children, but we never taught any kids to ride. We would have these 40 kids at a time come in busloads, and they were too few horses. We only had 3 horses, and mostly we teach them history, and they would like pet the horse's nose. So one day I said to Dr. Blair, what do we teach here? I kind of, excuse me, Dr. Blair. And he said, Sarah, do you know what a cowboy is? And I thought it was a rhetorical question. I mean, everybody knows what a cowboy is, Marlboro Man, John Wayne. And he said to me, Sarah, a cowboy is a Black man. And actually, etymologists, some believe that the root of the word cowboy speaks to the Blackness of the people who first had that profession. Because in the era that word was coined, boy would have been a pejorative for a white person, but it was a regular term to refer to a Black person, a houseboy in the 1700s, a yard boy. And so a cowboy, you would have called a white person who had that profession a cattleman or a rancher. And so it was actually a slave profession initially. Slaves were purchased from West Africa, which had a huge tradition of horsemanship, for their horse skills, and brought to America for that reason. Black cowboys have been entirely erased from the American narrative. In fact, in the pioneer era, 1 in 4 cowboys were Black. And you don't see them in any of our representations of movies, books about cowboys. And actually the West was quite a bit more integrated than the East, because life was just too damn hard there to keep up these partitions. Everybody needed to pitch in. Blacks were lawmen, Blacks were cowboys, and Blacks were as notorious as Billy the Kid during their day. But they were a part of that story, and they've never gone anywhere. They've only been removed from the story. And I went riding with the Black Cowboys of Texas, in particular a postman by the name of Larry Callis, who used his life savings to create the Museum to the Black Cowboy, to enshrine cowboys there who are enshrined nowhere else. The first ever Black cowboy was inducted in 1989 to the Cowboy Hall of Fame, called Bill Pickett, about 80 years after his death. And he invented the rodeo sport of wrangling a cow to the ground. And so they've been removed from that story. And in the Black Cowboys erasure from the American story, I felt a real parallel to our people's almost literal erasure, or the attempts to erase us from the story period. Something I don't get into my book that I feel quite remiss about now is the Black story in the Thoroughbred world. We've just had the Derby. Well, when you walk into a plantation, Sarah, you feel the blood that built that place. It's undeniable. But thoroughbred racing, the industry, is predicated on the same enslavement. People in the early days of racing ran the horses they owned with the humans they owned on their backs. And just to speak to that erasure, when you go to Churchill Downs, where the Derby is run, there's a beautiful bronze of Secretariat stretched out in a full gallop, his rider's jockey on his back. And then there is a bronze nearby of Aristides, the horse that won the first ever Kentucky Derby. Same position, same bronze, no rider on his back. And that's because that jockey was a Black man, the first ever Kentucky Derby, the winner, and the trainer of that horse was a freed slave. Those erasures, what the Holocaust Center here is doing is to prevent another erasure of the story. I think what Ilana said earlier, that people who learn about the Holocaust are more likely to have compassion for others. I feel that people who learn about other erased stories are more likely to write back in more people into their rightful place in our narrative.
Absolutely. I'm a historian by training, and I can tell you that archives are incomplete. That archives and like the stories that were preserved for a reason, and by folks who wanted to tell a certain part of the story just by virtue of the fact that they were preserving it. And the fact that that Black jockey that you referred to, Oliver Lewis, is not on Secretariats or on the statue of the winning. Yeah, I mean, it's just absolutely fascinating to me. And I think that, it's really, again, going back to the sport that is so obsessed with tradition. And I think it's really having a reckoning, and it has to face the fact that there are so many cracks to these, myths and these kind of origin stories of the sport. In the hunter jumper world, the one which I participate in, you participated as well.
Hunter jumper, for people who don't know, is what you see in the Olympics, jumping over poles.
Exactly. It kind of has this it derives its roots from the hunt, in the kind of colonial setting of Virginia, and before that, in England. And it's just, and the kind of, even the teachers of the sport, almost, in the absence of really kind of a methodical, certification program, they claim their fame to how close they were to these founding fathers of the sport, which I find super interesting. And I can't drop this little thread that I'm trying to weave this together. But going back to the fact that you wrote really important, you covered really important story for the hunter jumper world, about George Morris and Jimmy Williams, who are two of these founding fathers of the sport.
Well, just to show how much bullshit tradition is predicated on so often when it's not examined or unpacked, the people you reference were the luminaries of the sport. If I could describe George Morris, who's still alive, he's 81. He was the Olympic chef d'équipe. I think he was a gold or bronze medalist, and he's ran several Olympic teams. He's the biggest name in show jumping. I would describe him as Tom Brady and Babe Ruth together for the sport. When he writes things, they call it the Bible when he writes. And he was a pedophile. And it's an absolute known fact, open whisper in the industry. Here's a person being sent around the world to teach children who is not only pedophilic, a rapist. And I wrote an expose about both George Morris and his predecessor, who was deceased, Jimmy Williams, also a pedophile. And what was so interesting is that it faced tremendous backlash from the sport. People didn't want to knock down their idols. And people said, how could you do this to our sport, Sarah? And for me, my answer was, I do it because I love it, because I demand it be better. And actually subsequent to my article and my investigations, George Morris was banned for life from show jumping. but does that change the 70-year career he had and the pain he caused? No, but I think rewriting stories the way they should have been written all along is a deeply important project, and something you and the Holocaust Center are both participating in laudably.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So I want to talk a little bit more about horses. And I'm
always available to talk about horses. Let's go.
And I mean, it kind of actually reminds me of a part of your book where you work on Monty Roberts. So, you know, for those of you who don't know, Monty Roberts is kind of like another kind of founding father, but he's really kind of this iconic natural horseman style person. I think they call him the horse whisperer, and who really, you know, tries to train horses by understanding them and kind of meeting them where they're at, which is, I think, kind of different than sometimes like what happens in our sport in the hunter jumper world. And he says that, I think when you, I think you wrote this in your book, that he really like questioned again, like these traditions that have been passed down, you know, from horseman to horseman, about how it is that you train a horse. And I found that so interesting. Like, again, it's just like all of these figures in your book really kind of challenge all of our assumptions about the sport and how it's built, and, you know, how things are supposed to be done, how you're supposed to train a horse, who those founding, you know, folks were. But I was just curious if you could kind of speak a little bit about your decision to write about him, and maybe how you also attempt to kind of reconcile that with your participation in the competitive part of the sport.
Yeah. I'd actually hope that someone reading this book, because there are a lot of freaking weirdos in this book. I'm one of them. You know, I have a whole section on people who collect plastic model horses and compete them and drag them all over the country to compete store-bought model horses against store-bought model horses. This isn't like horses that they, you know, painted or anything. These are just from the store, and they compete them in live events. You know, I have a woman, an English socialite who imports banned horses to America by smuggling their semen in her pockets. You know, so I think that my hope is that they don't just buck tradition in the sport, but they show you about bucking tradition in life. That the road less trammeled is often the only road that you should take. But Monty Roberts is a very interesting character. He's in his 80s now. That movie, Robert Redford's The Horse Whisperers, based in part on him. And he is the reason why most training of horses is no longer breaking, where they would just make a untrained horse submit through brutality, but something closer to gentling, which he has reframed as creating a dialogue with a horse so that it sees you as its herd leader. And it capitulates because you're dominant to it, not because you've brutalized it. And he's really changed how the process is done. He was picked up by Queen Elizabeth, and she sent him all over the world to preach this gospel. And he has email exchanges with her. He's like, "Oh, just be back. I'm emailing my friend Elizabeth." And I'm like, "Who? Like Liz?" And he's like, "Yeah, Her Majesty is a great emailer." You know, he's one of those guys. Yeah, I have a complicated relationship with riding horses, because I don't believe it's a dance that some people say that you do with a willing partner. I believe that it's a type of enslavement of the animal, that they become an extension of my will. How I make peace with that, a complicated peace, is that we have created these creatures through millennia of breeding that are a perfect complement to us, that they can't exist in the wild, that they aren't a real creature, that they are a creature of human intention only. And so we owe them an ethic of care and stewardship. We've made them useless for themselves, but incredibly useful for us. Their femurs are the size of human femurs, yet they weigh 1,200 pounds. Their backs are broad for us to sit on, but not for their own safety and bodily integrity. And so it's a complex relationship, but awareness of it is the major piece of the puzzle to doing no harm in engaging in it.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely relate to that with my own horses and my inability to sell them. I feel that I owe them, a life beyond their athletic career. And that they'll always be with me. And I'm sure that, some don't really fully understand that because it's a financial, and kind of emotional commitment, but it's the way that I definitely square my love of being with them and riding them and competing with them and forcing them to, kind of live in these, crazy conditions that are, kind of probably they're not at all the natural way of living for horses.
But there's no such thing as a natural horse, right? The only natural horse is a Przewalski's wild horse. Even those were made extinct in the 80s, and they were resurrected by a couple who found them at an Eastern European zoo and ended up a breeding program. And now there's 3,000 in Mongolia. So, they're all figments. But the point is, if you create a dream, it's your responsibility to nourish it and care for it.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. So I want to ask you about a horse that has taught you the most.
Oh my God, can I answer every horse? I mean, there are these unbelievable dialogues that you have between them. It's an incredible privilege that they give you the time of day. And I even say, looking at a horse can make you feel and teach you something. Something I often talk about, I say, when you look at a dog or a cat, you think, oh, that's so cute. But when you look at a horse, you feel something. It's much more like looking at an ocean vista or a mountain range, and that to me speaks to what we've imbued in them, that they have some larger emotional significance than just being, fuzzy with big liquid eyes. And I can't possibly answer what a horse taught me the most. Being in their presence has taught me every life lesson I ever needed.
Horses are, they're such incredible. I always feel like, I always feel like with horses, like once I feel like I'm really getting somewhere and I feel like I'm really learning, it kind of opens up this other world where I feel like I'm just so at the beginning of the journey. They are so here on this earth to teach me something about life and people, way more than they are to teach me anything about horses.
Beautifully said.
So I want to ask you to read a little bit more from your book, and then we're going to have a Q&A, which all of the audience members can submit using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. But I was hoping that you could read a little bit about from the book about kind of one of your rides in the Virginia hunt, right?
No, that one is North Salem, the one you want.
Okay, North Salem.
Yeah. Sure. So I went fox hunting, which is a very strange thing for a vegetarian, lifelong vegetarian to do, but they don't catch foxes, they just chase the scent. And I galloped around with this incredible pageant of aristocracy. They wear colors signifying their status in the herd, and you're not allowed to pass them. And what does a horse want to do more than anything when it's in a wild, abandoning gallop? Pass everything behind it. And so there are all these rules just braided into this world, and it was so stressful, particularly with my long sense of the title of this, belonging and not belonging, or as my father would say, belonging and not belonging, which he felt was the issue with a tremendous number of his patients and with me, that we wouldn't assert our place in the world, that we felt that we were part of two worlds. And what we really needed was a sense of mastery, that it wasn't about making it or resume titles. It was a sense of mastering our life and truly belonging. So out on the hunt, we are supposed to jump a wall, and I gallop up to the wall and I'm cut off by a fancy pants guy on the Forbes 500 list, billionaire, who makes me crash into the wall instead of go over it. And the whole hunt is watching. So this is where this takes off. I wanted to flee. So I crashed and I'm like, I'm going home, I'm done. So I start to turn my horse away. Something about the crash, the pomp, the circumstance, the wealth, and all the unwritten rules I could feel braided invisibly all throughout the hunt experience had reverted me to the little girl I was in the pony ring. Like the girl I was waiting to be found out that I wasn't supposed to be here. At the base of that unjumped wall, I felt everyone had. Older now, I knew that what I felt was a type of generational trauma, belonging and not belonging, osmoted from my dad and my mom. For years now, I had kept that feeling stifled. And yet, like the fox, it may have been out of sight, but the scent of it was always in the air, somewhere in the distance, ready to close in. The sensation was overwhelming. Waves of anxiety told me to peel off into the forest and gallop for the safety of home. Then another redcoat approached me as we stopped in a gully. He did not deliver something, booze, because they drink the whole time they're on the hunt, but something more intoxicating. The master saw what happened and would like to invite you to ride beside him at the head of the hunt, the man said. Wordlessly, I followed him past the other horses and riders to the head of the herd. The master had witnessed my mini disaster and had seen, as I could not, that it was not my fault. Mastery was my father's catchphrase. It was his demand that I never hide as he did. He believed that what all of us were searching for is a sense of mastery, to own our place in the world. Ears pricked and riotous, next to the master, my horse was in charge. We vaulted over the felled trees and fence lines, and as we did so, I felt I had vaulted through the stiff hierarchy, placed a sash across my shoulders that seemed to flutter as we galloped. You belong. On a ridge, I halted beside the master. A fine snow started to fall. My misgivings abated, or perhaps it was all the booze, but I felt found in the wilderness, as horses so often let me feel. Why does your saddle say Nir on it? It was that bumbling hedge fund guy. He was pointing to my name engraved on a brass plaque on the back of my cantle, or on the back or cantle of my saddle. Are you related to Yehuda Nir? I swiveled on the pinto's back. He's my father, I said. The man replied, I read his book in the 90s. There, in the sprinkling snow, he recounted a scene from my father's memoir. As a teenager in hiding with a false identity of a Polish Catholic, my father had been interred in a German labor camp. When it was time for a mass shower presided over by Nazi guards, he feared that naked his Jewish identity would be exposed. He was circumcised, but the Nazis had made a mistake. They positioned female guards for the showers. The undersexed prisoners went wild, whipping towels at the women and hollering. The mayhem provided a distraction for my father to duck in and out unnoticed, his Jewish identity still hidden, his life spared. At least every few months, I still think of that scene, the man said, jerking the reins of his horse. I think of your father, the survivor. It was silent, but I heard the roar of history and of time, of belonging and not belonging vibrating the air. Here in the closed-off world, an outsider had led the hunt, and a Holocaust survivor had ridden alongside her, perched on the back of my saddle. I thought about the kick my father would have gotten living in the minds of these world beaters, galloping alongside them in their tony pursuits. Dad felt resurrected then, as if I would see him through the trees in scarlet at any moment. I could hear him among the whispering birch. Mastery. I understood what he meant then, that happiness is not the stuff or accolades, but mastering a craft, a skill, a world, the self, the feeling of understanding life and bringing it like a hound to heel. In the silent, snow-padded woods, I felt like my father was there with me, masters riding side by side.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I love that passage.
Thanks.
Sarah Mazlinier, I have a couple questions for you from audience members and others. One of them I want to ask you is, you've done a tremendous amount of traveling in your life for your work and elsewhere. And I'm wondering if in all those travels, if you ever went back to Lwów, Poland, where your father was from, and what that experience was like, or maybe why you didn't.
That's a great question. My father went back one time, only about 10 years before his death. He felt that it wasn't our home, that this was a place where his neighbors murdered his father and wanted them dead. And he didn't feel any kinship to it. And he went back, and actually it was really interesting. He was walking past an H&M, and he said to my mother, "This is where the Polish Liberation Army headquarters was." I'm getting it wrong, but this was a resistance headquarters. And my mom was like, "You're crazy," because it'd been 60 plus years. And actually he moved a decorative shrub aside, and it said headquarters of the army. And he spoke to a class there, a high school class, and he got up on stage and he recited the Lord's Prayer in Polish, the Catholic Lord's Prayer, because he had become an altar boy as one of his ways of hiding. And they went wild. They just roared for him. It was quite a return, but I feel no connection and no fealty to my Polish roots. Perhaps I object to them.
And the family that you've had the back and forth with, whether or not they rescued your father or, you know, did so thinking he was a Polish child, are there still communications back and forth? What was the outcome?
I'm not sure. They're the Hebowitz family, if I remember the name. Hebowitz? No, I'm getting it wrong. I can find it. It's in my father's book. No, but I think they are in Yad Vashem. And my aunt attended the ceremony, though my father boycotted it. She felt that my family did survive, and that's all that counted, even if the people got, you know, a cleaning lady and 2 slave farm laborers, unpaid farm laborers out of it. But no, I haven't followed up on where that has gone. Perhaps I don't feel emotionally safe doing so, now that I think about it.
Yeah. Well, there's another question here. This one comes from Martin, and he says, you've talked a little bit about this already, but how have your thoughts and emotions in regard to horses evolved throughout the years? And are you still a competitive equestrian?
Yes. The thing about writing a book is you get paid a little bit of money. And of course, I spent it on a horse. And my mom was like, really? And I was like, the book's not called Horse Sane. It's called Horse Crazy. So yes, I'm still a competitive equestrian. And I a show jumper like Sarah is in the hunter jumper world. My relationship, how has it changed? I think the enduring thing is that it hasn't. And in the first pages of my book, I talk about riding this elderly horse called Guernsey, where I pretty quickly toppled right off him, and I didn't get out of his way. And everyone's screaming, you know, get out of his way, he's cantering right back at you. And I didn't, I just lay there and Guernsey jumped over me. And instead of thinking horses are deeply dangerous, I just fell off a huge horse. I'm 2.5 years old. I imprinted in my mind that horses would always save me and they would always protect me because Guernsey jumped over me. And I think that has been deeply true. I am a rape victim. I am survived a knife attack in my home. And in both of those instances, horses have been my refuge and put me back on my own 2 feet using their 4.
Thank you for sharing that and for being so candid about it.
Have to be. I'm a journalist. All we do is tell the truth. It sucks.
Well, in writing and speaking about your book, you must meet other descendants of survivors, and I'm wondering if they often reach out to you with shared experiences. And do you find a connection there, or what is that like?
Yeah, I've met a number of second generation, because I'm pretty young to be first generation. My dad had me in his late 50s or early 50s. But a lot of people speak to what Sarah, well, actually, you know, the kind of made you look moment you had with Dr. Rosen's bio, you know, that's how people like she and I feel in this world. And if you can imagine, both of us passed because of our white skin. If you can imagine how Black or Asian riders feel in this elite and closed off world, passing is a huge part of it. And so many people have reached out and talked to me about they're always feeling as a Jew, as an outsider, and not being able to pass, which is painful when it's something you love so deeply. A friend of mine has a podcast called Young Black Equestrians, where she talks about these issues for Black people. And she made such a point, I did a Black history talk with her, that the helmets made for riders don't accommodate her hair. And so she has to get the junky, cheap ones. And so she looks like she is an undisciplined rider who doesn't know any better because she's wearing like, a piece of junk. And so there's these messaging that comes from all corners of elite circumscribed worlds that says you don't belong. So I've got a number of letters of people, Jews and otherwise, expressing that they too felt like outsiders, and this book makes them feel like maybe they have a place, which is a great feeling.
So, okay, so one last question for you then, just following up on that. What would be your advice to people who are entering this sport, or even just, out in the world, who are feeling that same feeling that you describe so often of trying to fit in and finding a place of belonging in a place where you're not sure you belong?
Can I kick that one to Sarah and then answer after she does?
Well, I am a huge proponent of the horse sport. And so I would tell anyone that if you feel any kind of sense of attraction, or you feel like your child or grandchild or anyone around you has a sense of attraction, to run towards a horse and go and find a great experience. That it teaches, I think, I think for young girls in particular, but anyone with any kind of, anyone who is just, I think, struggling in the world, or sensitive, or anything, it has so much ability to teach people, and especially to teach children. So I would highly recommend anyone get involved in horse sport if they can. And I think that, passion brings people together. And I think that, despite these kinds of, cracks in the tradition, and despite that, I think that these are the things that we have to kind of go after, as, to look around these places where we have our passion, and to find, folks who don't fit the mold, who are going, through different struggles, who, don't, ascribe their lineage to these, founding fathers in Virginia, or, upstate New York, or wherever. And then I think that, this is the stuff that gives our life meaning. So highly recommend horse sport for anyone who is interested.
I second Sarah's thoughts. One challenge is that, especially in America, it can be financially prohibitive. And I'm on the board of a therapeutic riding organization called Gallop NYC, which does riding in the 5 boroughs of New York City for disabled children, adults, veterans, survivors of domestic abuse. And there are many programs that have lowered the bar for access. And I think you don't have to be galloping around on horseback over obstacles to belong to the sport. There are plenty of people who just look into their big amber eyes, and I would qualify those people as horse crazy too, just being proximate to them. So there are volunteer opportunities. But I think a really important point to go into this, or any discipline, but really into this one, I'll be specific, is horses themselves are deeply democratic. As the great horse whisperer Monty Roberts says, they demand one thing of us, which is that we are their safe place to be. So horses could care less about your background, the color of your skin, your pedigree. They just require that you're their safe place to be. And equipped with that knowledge, you can be Sarah Nir, you can be Sarah Rosen, you can be Ralphie Lifshitz, and horses belong to you too.
That is a great point to end on. Will you also share, if people are interested in purchasing your book, or even want a signed copy, where can they find it?
Sure. So there is this wonderful bookshop right near my house. It is called Bravo's Book Nook, and I'm going to put a link in the chat. I think I can, right, guys?
Well, yes. If it doesn't go to everyone, we'll reshare it.
Okay. It's going to test my computer abilities. It's going to go I think I'm just send a panelist and you guys will reshare it. So it's actually around the corner from my house. It's called Bravo's Book Nook. And because it's around the corner, I've signed all the copies there. So you're shopping local and doing a good deed with that. And if you email them and want it personalized, I will walk over and personalize it to whomever you'd like to buy it for. So I think the organizers are going to share that with all of you right now.
Just did. Well, thank you so much, Sarah and Sarah, for joining us today and being a part of this program and sharing your stories and your passion and your history. We're really grateful to have you both here.
Well, thank you for thinking of me, both of you. It's deeply meaningful to connect my Jewishness to horses in this way. I've done a lot of talks. I have never talked about this side of the story, but it's our story, and I really, really can't thank you enough.
Awesome, thank you. And thank you to everybody for joining us for today's program. It's been recorded, so you can find it on our website starting tomorrow, along with all the other past Lunch and Learn presentations. Just a reminder that today and tomorrow is your opportunity to participate and give big and donate to the nonprofits that are meaningful to you. I want to give a special thank you to Richard Green, our Museum and Technology Director, who is running the technical side of this show. Also, a huge thank you to our Executive Director, Dee Simon, and to Lori Wilshire-Cohen and Craig Bernice. Thank you also to Nicole Bella, Julia Thompson, Paul Regelbrug, Ellie Selesky, Amanda Davis, Rick Brewer, Katie Lawrence, Morgan Romero, and Devin Shire-Locke, all who make these programs possible. We have a wonderfully strong team. And thank you to Michelle Quinones for providing closed captioning. I hope you will join us next week to hear the remarkable story of Max and Helene Schlonau. As Jews in Germany, they managed a farm and were leaders in their small community until 1938, when under Nazi control, they fled Germany for the United States. Their grandson, Steve Pruzan, will share their story. Thank you so much for joining us today, and this concludes our program.